Recording has started.
Yeah. Yeah, members have started coming in.
Hi Manu, how are you?
Hi, I'm fine.
Good,
How are you?
Santosh. How are you doing?
Good, yeah.
Pratik, can we start now?
Yes.
Already, I think more than 150 members have joined.
Yeah, you can start now.
Okay. Good evening, friends. This being the first meeting of the new BCSE financial year 2021-22, myself, convener Nilesh Vasa for this year, with Pradeep Chandwani as a deputy convener. We welcome all the members to this BCSE new financial year 21-22. This is the first seminar of the year, and we are really proud that we have got a long list of members who are already associated with BCSE since last 10 years. And we have today esteemed speaker Manan Lakhani and Santosh Malarji, who will be guide us on the topic today. I would now request Aman Khandelwal to please give a brief introduction of both our speakers.
Good evening, members.
Nilesh bhai,
First,
just a minute. Hello.
that
Motto
Okay.
and ethics video.
Okay.
After that, we can start.
First, we will have a motto and ethics video. Sikandar, please proceed.
Yes, sir.
Members, please raise for the institute motto.
एष सुप्तेषु जागृति एष सुप्तेषु जागृति कामं 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 कामपुरुषो पुरुषो निर्विमाणः निर्विमाणः तदेव शुक्रं तद्ब्रह्मा तद्ब्रह्मा तदेवामृतमुच्यते तस्मिन् लोकः शतः सर्वे तदूनात्यपि कश्चनात्यपि कश्चन एतद्द्वैता 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 एतद्द्वैता
Thank you, friends. Thank you, members. We welcome all our members for this first virtual CP meeting of BCSE on Ind AS, case studies on financial instruments, disclosures, and fair value concept. We are privileged that we have CA Manan Lakhani and CA Santosh Malay as our single speaker for the day. Now I'd request Aman Khandelwal to please give a brief introduction of both our speakers.
Good evening, members. Today we have two very learned and experienced speakers to guide us through our today's session on Ind AS. Now let me briefly introduce CA Manan. CA Manan Lakhani is a chartered accountant and has also obtained a diploma in international financial reporting from ACCA UK. He has post-qualification experience of more than 16 years in areas of accounting and advisory and audit. He is currently a member of Financial Accounting Advisory Services team of the member firm of EY India. Prior to joining EY Associates LLP, he was associated with PwC in Mumbai and KPMG UK based out of London, specializing in accounting advisory services. He has extensive experience of leading Ind AS conversion and advisory projects and implementation of new Ind AS and other accounting advisory services involving complex areas such as financial instruments, business combinations, revenue recognition, leases, etc. He is also a speaker at various professional forums and has imparted various trainings on Ind AS. He has also been involved in developing educational material and guidance notes issued by ICAI. Now I'll give a brief introduction of CA Santosh Malay. He has passed his CA examinations with an All India merit rank, has worked for Big Four audit firms and IFRS desk for more than a decade. He has over 16 years of professional experience in accounting, advisory services, and audit and assurance, including in large audit firms. He has extensive experience of dealing with complex technical accounting issues across various large clients that this firm has served. He has also served a 2-year stint in London, wherein he had the opportunity to closely work with the International Accounting Standards Board on IFRS standard setting projects such as financial instruments, that is IFRS 9, revenue, IFRS 15, and service concessions, that is IFRIC 12. Santosh sir has been serving as a special invitee on ICAI's Accounting Standards Board, technical resource for the ICAI's Expert Accounting Committee and Research Committee, and has been a part of several technical study groups of the ICAI, including on Ind AS 12 and Ind AS 116, guidance note on share-based payments, guidance note on accounting for e-commerce transactions, ICAI's guidance note on accrual basis of accounting 2021, guidance note on share-based payments, guidance note on e-commerce, combined financial instruments, guidance note on SEBI's ICDR regulations as per Ind AS, amongst others. He's a member of Accounting and Auditing Committee of the BCA. He has delivered several lectures and facilitated technical workshops for BCA. He has also authorized various professional books, including Practical Guide to Financial Instruments, Ind AS Practices Demystified, Guide to Ind AS under MAT, and Practical Guide to Ind AS 115, Ind AS Accounting Manual, and Accounting and Auditing, a Checklist Approach. Now, I would, as a tradition, we would like to make a contribution to CABF Benevolent Fund on behalf of the speaker and offer a e-memento to the speakers. Now, I request the learned speakers to start their session for the day.
Yeah. Without taking time of the members, Manan sir, please start the presentation.
Sure. So first of all, I would like to thank the team of Borivali Central CP Study Circle for inviting me for this session. It is indeed a privilege to present here, and I hope that all the members are kind of staying safe in this environment. So now I'll just kind of present my screen. Are you able to see the screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I think primarily I'm going to talk on two topics. One is Ind AS 32, which is primarily the accounting standard kind of giving guidance on debt versus equity classification. And we'll also cover Ind AS 109, which kind of primarily gives guidance on recognition, measurement, and derecognition of financial instruments. So what I've done is, considering that there has already been some time since the transition to Ind AS has happened, I have included only kind of case studies. So I haven't kind of included in terms of any theory or something. And while I may talk something during the entire presentation, you will only find examples during the entire kind of presentation. So first, what I'm going to cover is Ind AS 32, which is primarily debt versus equity. So I think before we get into the example, I think the key principle of Ind AS 32 is whenever there is a financial instrument, the issuer needs to determine whether that instrument is a debt instrument or an equity instrument. And there are two key kind of underlying principles for this. One is basically whether the issuer has any kind of contractual obligation to pay cash to the holder of the instrument, and if let's say it's a convertible instrument, then whether the conversion is into a fixed number of equity shares. So that's a very high level kind of a discussion, but these are the underlying kind of principles for evaluating whether a particular instrument is debt or equity. So kind of moving on, let's go to the first example here. Now, if we look at the first example, so there's a bank which has issued a bond with a fixed 8% coupon. Now, the coupon can be deferred in perpetuity at the option of the bank. Now, the bank has a history of paying the coupon each year, and based on the current trend as well, the holders of the bond do have an expectation that the coupon will be paid each year. Also, the bank has a policy that the coupon will be paid each year. So whether such a bond will be classified as a liability or equity. Now, let's look at the clause relating to the coupon. So now if we see the coupon, there is a discretion of the bank that the coupon can be deferred. It need not be paid. So it is entirely at the discretion of the bank. While there is a history of paying the coupon and possibly there is a policy of the bank which states that coupon will be paid each year, we need to basically look at the contractual terms of the instrument. And contractually speaking, the bank is not obligated to pay the coupon. So in this case, considering that the principal is also non-redeemable and the coupon is to be payable completely at the discretion of the bank, the entire instrument will be classified as equity. So let's move to the next example. So let's look at some of the kind of structure of instruments that we kind of commonly see, and whether such instruments will be classified as a debt or equity. So if we see the first kind of column, so there's a contract to deliver as many of the entity's own equity instruments as are equal to 100 rupees. So let's say I have issued certain preference shares or bonds of 100 rupees, and what I have included in the terms is that the holder of the preference shares or the bond will get equity instruments worth rupees 100. So here what happens is that, let's say when the conversion happens, you will see what is the fair value of the underlying equity shares, and you will divide that by 100, or you will divide 100 by the fair value of the equity instrument and arrive at the number of equity shares to be issued on conversion. So in effect, what happens is that it doesn't meet the fixed for fixed criteria. So it's basically you're paying back this 100 rupees instead of cash, you are issuing your own shares. So in this case, when there is a contract which basically can results in issuing variable number of equity shares of the entity, that contract is a financial liability, not a equity instrument. So for example, in practice, you would have seen various bonds or preference shares which eventually get converted based on the fair value of the equity shares, underlying equity shares at the date of conversion. So what happens typically in those cases is that the number of equity shares is kind of not fixed on day one. So such instruments would generally be classified as a liability instrument. Now let's go to the second example. So again, contracts to deliver as many of the entity's own equity instruments as are equal to 100 grams of gold. So again, there is a variability attached to the instrument. So for an instrument to be classified as equity, it has to be convertible into fixed number of equity shares on day one, at the time of inception of the contract itself. So now let's look at the third example. So there's a contract to deliver 100 of the entity's own equity instruments for 100 rupees. So this clearly defines that for 1 rupee, you will get 1 equity share. So essentially what happens in this case is the holder of the instrument is subject to the equity risk. So essentially, whatever is the the movement in the share price post the issuance of such instruments, the holder of the instrument is subject to that risk. So effectively, if there is a contract which requires the company to deliver a fixed number of equity instruments, then that underlying contract is the equity instrument itself. Now the last one is also similar to the third one, the contract to deliver 100 of the equity entity's own equity instruments for no consideration. Again, similar, it's a fixed consideration. Even no consideration is like a fixed amount. So I think the practically speaking, wherever you find instruments like a compulsorily convertible preference shares or a compulsorily convertible debenture or a bond, I think we really need to be mindful of what are the contractual terms of those bonds or debentures, and depending on that, those instruments will be classified as either equity or liability. Now let's look at the third example. Now company X issues 2000 optionally convertible preference shares on 1st April 21 with the following features. The term of the preference shares is 5 years. The face value is 1000 each. Redemption, so it is going to be redeemable at the end of 5 years. The dividend on this is discretionary, non-cumulative dividend of 6% per annum. Conversion option, so it is optionally convertible by the holder into ordinary shares at any time until maturity. The conversion ratio, so each preference share is convertible into 5 equity shares. So now what company X has also assessed is that the market rate for the similar instrument, but with a mandatory coupon and without the conversion option, is 9%. So how will such optionally convertible preference shares be accounted in the books of the issuer? So again, we are looking at Ind AS 32 is primarily from the perspective of the issuer, not the holder of the instrument. So basically, this OCPS are financial instruments that are required to be classified in accordance with the guidance in Ind AS 32. Now, basically what we need to look at is we need to break this instrument into 3 parts. One is the redeemable principal amount, the discretionary coupon, and the third is the conversion option. So here what happens is that the redeemable principal amount is like a financial liability, because what happens is that if the instrument is not converted by the holder, the company is still obliged to pay cash to the holder of the instrument. The dividend in this case is completely discretionary because the company has no obligation to pay dividend to the holders. And the conversion option is basically each OCPS will be converted into a fixed number of equity shares. So that will meet the definition of equity as per Ind AS 32. So the point which I'm trying to make here in this example is that we will need to evaluate each component of the instrument. It is not just that we go by the underlying legal form of the instrument, as we used to do under Indian GAAP. So typically under Indian GAAP, preference shares would be classified as share capital or under equity, whereas under Ind AS we will need to look at each of the component of that instrument, which include the principal amount, the coupon, is there any convertibility feature in that instrument, and accordingly kind of decide the classification as equity or liability. So now let's look at the other example. So there is a cumulative convertible bond whose interest payments are based on the discretion of the entity. However, the terms also include that this instrument will become mandatorily payable if the company doesn't come out with an IPO at the end of 3 years from the instrument's issuance date. So how will you classify such instruments under Ind AS 32? Now, while it is specified that the amount will be payable only if there is no IPO by the end of 3 years, the thing that needs to be evaluated is that whether the IPO is within the control of the company or not. And typically a successful IPO is not within the company's control, and hence even if, let's say, there is a condition that the amount will be payable only if there is no IPO, still there is no discretion which the company has to not pay this amount, and because of which this instrument will be classified as a liability from day one. So what we need to look at is if there is any contingent settlement provision that payment will be made only if a certain event happens. What we need to see in that case is whether that event is within the control of the company or not. And if that event is not within the control of the issuer, then this instrument is a liability and not equity. So for any instrument to be equity, there has to be an unconditional right which the company should have to not pay anything when the instrument matures, basically. So now let's look at another example. Now company H issues a non-redeemable preference shares on which dividends are payable only if the entity pays a dividend on the equity shares. Now, how should these preference shares be classified? Now, let's look at the clause for paying the dividend. So on the principal portion, it is said that it is non-redeemable. So effectively, there is no obligation to pay the principal. Now, if we look at the dividend, requirement, it says that dividend on such preference shares are to be paid only if the dividend is paid on the equity shares. Now, what happens is that the payment of dividend on equity shares is within the control of the company, and because of which, indirectly, the payment of dividend on the preference shares is also within the control of the company. So in this case, essentially, there is no obligation on company H to pay dividend because it is linked to the payment of dividend on the equity shares, which itself, for which the company has a discretion. So in this case, again, the preference shares will be classified as equity. Now let's look at another example. So entity A issues 1,000 convertible bonds on 1st July 2008 at par value of 1,000 rupees each. The bond have a 3-year term and interest at 6% is paid annually in arrears. The bond is convertible at the option of the holder at any time until maturity at a rate of 250 ordinary shares per bond. So each bond will be converted into 250 equity shares. The prevailing market rate for a similar bond without the conversion feature is 9%. So if let's say you had just issued a plain debt without any conversion feature, then you would have charged a 9% interest. So here again, let's look at what are the components of this instrument. So one component is, of course, the principal. Now for the principal amount, there are two basically features. One is that it could be either converted by the holder, or it could be, if the conversion doesn't happen, then you have to pay the principal at the end of the tenure. As far as the bond interest is concerned, it is to be payable mandatorily annually, which is 6%. So what we need to look at is that this instrument has got two components. One is the liability component, which is essentially the obligation to pay to the holder if the conversion doesn't happen, and the obligation to pay the 6% interest annually. At the same time, it also has an equity component, which is basically the conversion of each bond, the conversion option of each bond into 250 equity shares. So essentially, that number of equity shares to be issued is fixed on day one. So here, what we need to do is we need to split this instrument into the debt component and the equity component. Now, how would you typically split that? So first, we'll need to calculate the present value of the principal payable at the end of 3 years. Now, the discounting rate here, which we need to use, is basically the 9% discount rate, not the 6%. Because had you issued a bond without any conversion feature, you would have paid 9%. So you present value the principal payable, which gives you 7,72,000. And then you also present value the interest payable. Again, you discount it at 9%. So which gives you the value of the liability component as 9,24,061. So the 10 lakh which you receive on day one has to be split into two parts. One is the liability component, which basically is 9,24,061, and the residual amount you will attribute to the equity component. So under Indian GAAP, you would have typically presented this entire bond as a liability under long-term borrowing. But under Ind AS, you will need to split it between the equity component and the debt component. Now let's look at the another interesting example. I think this is also you would generally find such instruments, typically where there is a private equity investor and so on. So let's say a company issues a CCPS, which are convertible at the option of the holder into ordinary shares for a fixed basis. So each CCPS will be converted into a fixed number of equity shares. Now, the terms of the instrument include a down round provision or a ratcheting feature whereby the conversion price is reduced for any subsequent at market issuance of ordinary shares at a price below the instrument's original strike price. So effectively, it means that when the CCPS were issued, there would have been an assumption of a particular conversion price. Now, if subsequent to the issuance of the CCPS, any new instruments are issued for which the price is below the instrument's original conversion price, then the conversion price of the originally issued CCPS will be modified. Otherwise, there are no other features that would cause the liability classification. So basically what happens is here the key thing is that, as I mentioned earlier, the number of equity shares to be issued has to be fixed on day one. But in some cases, to give protection to the the earlier CCPS holders, there is a clause which says that if there is a subsequent issuance at a price below the conversion price, then you need to compensate the earlier CCPS holders also by a change in the conversion price. So typically, this is a non-derivative instrument. The issuance of new shares is within the control of the company which has issued the CCPS, right? And there is no obligation to deliver a variable number of equity instruments, because the key thing here is that since the entity also has control over the issuance of subsequent equity shares, the entire instrument is meets the fixed for fixed test, and the ratcheting feature or the down round protection feature is ignored. So such CCPS will be classified as equity. So here you will find such clauses, very common in the investor agreements and so on, where there is a protection given to a CCPS holder from any subsequent issuance at a less than market price. So we need to carefully evaluate those features because those features, effectively may taint the fixed for fixed rules. But if it doesn't taint the fixed for fixed rule, then the CCPS can be classified as equity. Now, it's the similar example. The only thing is, instead of a CCPS, there have been warrants or options issued to holders to buy a fixed number of equity shares. Now, there is a similar feature in the warrant that if there is any subsequent issuance of shares at less than 20 rupees, which is the strike price of the warrant, then the strike price of the warrants issued will be adjusted to that new price. So will this impact the fixed for fixed classification? Now here the underlying instrument is an option, which is a derivative instrument. Now, though on day one you've mentioned that the options will be converted into a fixed number of shares. However, this option is not within the control of A, because effectively the holder may exercise the option to buy the equity share in that sense. So here the fixed for fixed test is not met, because the warrant holders may get variable number of shares if, let's say, there is a subsequent issuance of ordinary shares. So here in this case, the warrants will be classified as equity instrument as a derivative. So that was predominantly on Ind AS 32. The key kind of takeaway from that is essentially any instrument like a CCPS or a bond or a debenture or any optionally convertible instrument, we need to clearly evaluate the terms of those instruments, whether there is any contractual obligation to pay cash, whether there is any convertibility feature, and if there is a convertibility feature, what is the conversion ratio? Is the conversion based on a future event, or is the payment on such instrument based on a future event like an IPO or something? Because all these instruments, all these terms will impact the classification of these instruments, and consequently, this will always have an impact on, things like the debt equity ratio and so on. So moving on, let's look at Ind AS 109. Now, Ind AS 109, typically, as I mentioned, it covers recognition, measurement, derecognition, impairment requirements relating to financial instruments. What we are going to cover today is some of the examples involving the classification of financial assets, and we will also look at some of the derecognition relating requirements of financial assets and financial liability. Now, as you may be aware, any financial asset has to be kind of classified into either of the three categories. One is fair value through profit and loss, fair value through other comprehensive income, or amortized cost. And then there are rules governing that. The key rules being the solely payment of principal and interest. So if any instrument has the terms which is basically meets the solely payment of principal and interest, then we need to move to the next test, which is a business model test. And if the business model test is hold to collect contractual cash flows, essentially that instrument can be classified as amortized cost. However, if it doesn't meet the hold to collect contractual cash flows, then we may have to classify the instrument as fair value through OCI. So it all depends on the nature of the instrument as well, whether it is an equity instrument or whether it's a debt instrument, and accordingly we need to evaluate the classification of such financial assets. Now let's look at some of the examples. So here a non-financial entity anticipates incurring capital expenditure in a few years' time. The entity invests its excess cash in financial assets in order to fund the expenditure when the need arises. Now, the objective of managing the financial assets is to maximize the return on those financial assets. So let's say it could be a bond or a debenture or anything of that sort. Now, accordingly, the entity will sell financial assets and reinvest the cash when there is an opportunity to get a higher yield. And the manager for this portfolio is remunerated based on the return generated by the financial asset. So now what happens is, in this case, because there is an objective to kind of fund the expenditure, the capital expenditure in future, the entity will kind of sell the financial assets and reinvest and so on. And because there is a continuous sale or an infrequent or there's a frequent sale of those assets, these investments will be classified as fair value through other comprehensive income. So only if there are investments which are held till maturity or held to collect the contractual cash flows, you can classify it as amortized cost. But if you sell the instruments to achieve a particular objective, and those sales are frequent in nature, then you need to classify the investments in those bonds or debentures as fair value through other comprehensive income. So let's look at the next example now. So again here, XYZ Limited holds a portfolio of debt instruments whose value is approximately equal to 10 million. The company has appointed a separate employee to manage the portfolio. The employee is mandated to optimize the long-term yield on the portfolio, and because of which the fund manager essentially regularly sells the assets and reinvests the proceeds in new assets. However, the entity generates insignificant gains or losses when they sell the asset. So how do we typically measure such instruments, such debt instruments? So here, based on the factors, someone can argue that the objective of the entity is not to realize fair value gains or losses, but this may not be sufficient because there is a continuous sale of such assets and reinvestment of the proceeds in new assets. And because the sales are frequent, the entire kind of portfolio will have to be measured at fair value through other comprehensive income in this case as well. So now let's look at another example, which is more kind of common in the financial services sector, where a company sets up a kind of securitization vehicle, Z in this case, and the loans are sold by, let's say, the NBFC to the securitization vehicle, and pass-through certificates are issued by the SPV to the NBFC as well as other investors. Now the cash flows for the NBFC or for the selling entity is largely from the underlying loans which it has sold to the securitization vehicle. So basically the NBFC sells the loan to the SPV and the SPV issues pass-through certificates to the NBFC. Now the returns on the pass-through certificates are also essentially from the underlying loans itself. Now how do we assess the business model for the loans which are given by the NBFC or entity Y in this case? Now, in this case, the SPV is consolidated by entity Y. So we need to evaluate the business model at two stages. One is the consolidated financial statements of entity Y and the standalone financial statements of entity Y. Now, from a consolidated perspective, the loans are held to collect the contractual cash flows. So even though it is sold by the NBFC to the SPV, at the consolidated level, those loans will still be reflected in the books of the NBFC, and those are to collect the contractual cash flows because the SPV is not further selling those loans. So at the consolidated book, the loans will be classified as amortized cost. However, if you look at the separate financial statement or the standalone accounts of the NBFC, what it does is that it sells the loans to the SPV. And because of this, the amortized cost may not be the appropriate classification in the separate account. So there we will need to probably classify it as either FVTPL or FVOCI, depending on the sale which is being made. So here again, the point being that, specifically in the financial services sector, we'll need to look at, in such cases, both at the standalone entity as well as the consolidated entity level. Okay, now let's look at another example. So again, I think practically you might have seen loans where, the interest is linked to let's say the EBITDA of the borrower or the debt to equity ratio of the borrower. Now in this case, the term says that the contractual interest will increase if the borrower's EBITDA or debt to equity ratio deteriorates by a specified amount. Now whether such instrument will meet the SPPI test, because only if this instrument meets the SPPI test, then you can classify it as amortized cost. Otherwise, you would have to fair value the entire instrument. So here, what we need to basically evaluate at first glance, we may feel that, okay, it is linked to the EBITDA or the debt to equity ratio, and hence, ideally it should not meet the SPPI test. But we need to closely evaluate whether such increase or such change in the interest rate is linked to the underlying credit risk of the issuer. So let's say because the EBITDA has worsened or the debt equity ratio has worsened, the credit risk of the counterparty has in effect worsened, and hence there is an additional interest which is charged to compensate for the increased credit risk. So that is one scenario. The other scenario could be, no, I mean, it is not essentially linked to the credit risk. And we need to, also see the underlying kind of, how much is the movement and, whether there are any other factors which are also involved in kind of linking this interest rate to EBITDA or debt equity ratio. If it is not, linked to the credit risk of the counterparty, or it is not as a credit protection, then it will not meet the SPPI test. And hence you will have to fair value this entire loan or debenture that you would have kind of made investment in. So let's look at some other examples. So there's an instrument F, a bond, which is convertible into equity instruments of the issuer. So now typically any convertible instruments, which is kind of converted into equity instruments, most likely it will not meet the SPPI test, and hence, it will be classified as, fair value through PNL. The other example is bond with a stated maturity date and pays a variable market interest rate, which is capped. So in this case, while there's a capping on the interest, this could still meet the SPPI test. The third example, a loan that pays an inverse floating rate. So if the interest rate has an inverse relation to the market interest rate, then it doesn't meet the SPPI test because there is a leverage involved in such a transaction. The fourth is a constant maturity bond, let's say 5-year bond that pays a variable rate that is reset periodically. So after, let's say, every quarter or half year, it is reset to a 5-year maturity. So ideally it should be to a residual maturity, not a constant maturity. So in this case, because it is reset to a 5-year maturity always, it will not meet the SPPI test. So now let's look at the other kind of aspect involving derecognition. So I'm sure many of you would have seen a factoring kind of transaction where a portfolio of receivables is sold by a company to a bank or something like that. So how do we kind of evaluate the accounting for such transaction? So let's look at this example. Now there's a bank which holds a portfolio of receivable with a carrying amount of 1 lakh rupees. It enters into a factoring arrangement with Bank B, under which it transfers the portfolio via an assignment to Bank B in exchange of 90,000. So essentially, this entire portfolio is sold by Bank A to Bank B. Now, as per the contractual terms, all sums collected by the debtor are paid by Bank A to a specially nominated account. Bank A is only servicing the loan and has no rights to cash flows. However, Bank A agrees to reimburse Bank B in cash for any shortfall between the amount collected and the initial consideration of 90,000 which is paid. And once the receivable has been repaid, any sum which is above 90,000, which is the initial consideration, will also be paid back to Bank A. So whether these receivables should be derecognized by Bank A. So basically, just to summarize, Bank A is selling certain receivables to Bank B. However, it is basically guaranteeing or giving a credit enhancement, so to say, to compensate the Bank B for any loss which Bank B is going to occur. Also, if anything is received over and above 90,000, it will again come back to Bank A. So while in legal form or while in the contract it appears that I have sold the receivable, but in substance the bank who is selling, which is Bank A, has substantially retained all the risk and rewards relating to the ownership of the receivable, because the underlying loss on that receivable, even after the sale to Bank B, still belongs to Bank A. So I will continue to show, the Bank A will continue to show the loans, the receivables in its own books, and whatever amount is received from Bank B will be considered as an obligation or a liability to pay back to Bank B. Okay, now let's look at a couple of examples on financial liability. Now, I think because of this COVID scenario and so on, a lot of companies have kind of undertaken renegotiations of the loans, for a more kind of favorable term in that sense. So in this case, company X has an existing loan of 50 crores. The transaction cost was 1 crore, and the amortized cost as at 1st April 21, which is the date of modification, is 495 million. interest rate of the original loan is 12%. The remaining maturity term is 2 years. The effective interest rate on this existing loan is 12.49%. And other terms of the instrument include the fact that it is repayable on maturity only, and there is a prepayment penalty of 1% which will be levied. Now, what happens is on 1st April 21, the company believes that it will need to restructure the loan and have some more favorable payment terms considering the business situation. So it modifies the terms of the loan. It approaches the bank and gets the loan modified. Now it incurs certain transaction cost, which is 70 lakh rupees, including 20 lakhs for modification. The new interest rate is 9% per annum. The remaining maturity now is 7 years instead of the 2 years of the original loan, and it is repayable in 5 equal annual installments. So earlier loan was repayable on maturity. However, the new loan is now repayable on 5 equal annual installments commencing from 1st April 24. Now, so how do we account for this under Ind AS? So what we need to look at under Ind AS is typically when the modification happens, whether such modification is a substantial modification of the liability or it is a non-substantial modification. If it is a substantial modification, then you have to derecognize the existing loan and recognize the new loan and recognize a gain or loss on the closure of the existing loan. However, if it is a non-substantial modification, then you just need to make a catch-up adjustment. So you just need to account for a modification gain or loss. Now, what constitutes a substantial modification? So essentially what the standard says is there are two things that you need to evaluate. One is a qualitative aspect and one is a quantitative aspect. Now the qualitative aspect is essentially whether the terms of the loan have changed so significantly that you may not be actually required to do a quantitative assessment. So for example, the earlier loan was repayable, for example, and now under the new terms the loan will be converted into equity shares hypothetically at a future date. So now this prima facie looks like a substantial modification without getting into the quantitative assessment, because there is now a convertibility feature, for example, introduced in the loan, or let's say a foreign currency loan becomes an INR loan. So qualitative criteria are such kind of criteria which prima facie you can probably consider that there is a substantial modification. The other way to evaluate is quantitative criteria. So what the standard says is that if the contractual cash flows as per the revised terms of the loan are different by more than 10% of the contractual cash flows under the existing terms of the loan, then there is a substantial modification. So what we basically need to do is estimate the present value of the revised cash flows using the original effective interest rate, which is 12.49% per annum, and compare that number with the amortized cost of the loan as per the original term. If the difference is more than 10%, then there is a substantial modification and you need to derecognize the old loan and recognize a new loan. So let's look at the analysis. So in this case, the company has performed a quantitative assessment. The present value of the remaining cash flows is 49 crores, and as per the old loan, old terms, it is 44 crores. So the difference is approximately 11%. So basically what we'll need to do is you need to derecognize the old loan, which is 44 crores. You need to recognize the new loan at the fair value, and the difference is basically a loss on derecognition of the loan, which is 41 lakhs in this case. So let's look at the accounting entry. And considering this is an extinguishment of the loan, any transaction cost or fees which you have paid for the modification will also be charged to the P&L as a modification gain or loss. So if you see the old loan, which is 49 crores, you'll debit the old loans. Bank is basically the fee that you paid of 70 million. Borrowing the new loan, which is 50 crores, which you will recognize. And this difference of 1 crore 11 lakh, that is essentially a loss on extinguishment of the loan. So this is the accounting that you will do when the modification happens to the old loan. Now, moving to the next example, I think you might have come across situations where a liability is extinguished by issuing a equity instrument. So it is basically converted into equity instruments. So let's take a quick example here. Again, a company X has issued 1,10.5% cumulative redeemable preference shares. The carrying amount of the shares is 98 lakhs. Interest is 10.5%. Original maturity date is 31st March 24. Fair value of the preference shares is 90 lakhs. Now, the company has restructured this loan. Now, new terms, as per the new terms, conversion of cumulative redeemable preference shares into 6% non-cumulative compulsorily convertible preference shares. The dividends are payable at the discretion of the company, and each preference share will be converted into 10 equity shares. So what has happened is, because this new instrument is converted into equity shares, fixed number of equity shares, and the dividend on this new share is also discretionary, the new instrument which is issued is in the nature of equity, whereas the earlier instrument, which is the 10.5% cumulative redeemable preference shares, was a liability. So what has happened is that the company has converted its liability into equity, and the fair value of the new equity instruments issued is 1 crore 10 lakhs. So how do we account for such transactions? So here there is a specific guidance under Ind AS. Basically what you need to do is you need to account for the new equity instrument issued at fair value of the new shares issued. You derecognize the carrying amount of the liability and take any difference to P&L. So here the equity instruments which have been issued have a carrying value of 1 crore 10 lakh, whereas the liability has a value of 9 million. So there is a loss on derecognition of 1 million. Okay, moving on to the last example, which is on financial guarantee. Now a financial guarantee was issued by a parent for a loan taken by its subsidiary. The loan was initially scheduled to be repaid over a period of 10 years, and therefore a liability of let's say 1,000 rupees was created by the parent for the guarantee issued, and it would be amortized over a 10-year period. Now this loan is prepaid after 6 years. So what do we do with the unamortized portion? So you still have, at the end of 6 years, you will still have a 400 rupee financial guarantee liability in the books of the parent. So what the ITFG, and there's an ITFG as well on this, which says that if there is any change in the estimate of the expected life and so on, then you need to make those changes prospectively in the P&L. So in this case, because there has been a prepayment at the end of year 6, whatever outstanding amount of the financial guarantee is kind of outstanding in the books of the parent, that will be reversed with a recognition of revenue in the P&L on the date when the prepayment happens effectively. So I think with that, we kind of complete this session on Ind AS 32 and Ind AS 109. I would be happy to take any questions around this.
There are total 4 questions are there, sir.
Okay.
The first one is in example 1, do we have to see whether it meets fixed criteria?
One second, I can probably just
Example
check.
1, yes.
Yeah, okay. In example 1, do we have to see whether it meets
It's
the
fixed
for
for
fixed?
criteria.
Right. So let me go back to example 1. No, but example 1, there is no conversion feature, right? So example 1 is essentially a kind of only the coupon which we need to evaluate, not the conversion. So the fixed for fixed criteria is to be evaluated only when there is a convertibility feature in the instrument.
Okay. So can we take the second question?
Yes, yes. So in example 1,
Past history tells us that they were paying dividend each year. Then also it is not called liability.
yes, yes. So
Just
I
of
think
that it past is ignored.
yes, yes, exactly. So I think that was the point which I wanted to kind of make in that example, that even if, let's say, historically there is a kind of distribution of dividend, still we need to go with the contractual terms of the instrument.
Okay.
We cannot go with the past history essentially.
Okay. The next question is how dividend component in example 3 will be measured.
Okay, let me
Example
just
3.
yeah. So let me just open example 3. Right. Again, so again in this case, I think the dividend component is still equity. So effectively what we'll need to do is we will need to first calculate the liability component, and then the equity component will be the residual amount. So we don't have to specifically calculate the dividend component. So you'll just have to calculate the liability component of relating to the repayment of the principal discounted at the market rate, which is 9%, and the residual will be allocated to equity. And whenever there is a dividend payment, then that should ideally be a charge to equity. So you don't have to calculate the dividend component separately. It is a residual component after calculating the liability component.
Okay. Then next question is for example number 4, how discretionary interest will be accounted.
Yeah, so I just answered that in the sense that so that because it's an equity component, if at all there is a payment of that, then it will be a debit to equity.
Okay. Then the next question is how the fair value of financial asset is determined, like infra loan.
So again, I think fair value, how it is determined is typically not covered in 109, but essentially we'll need to kind of look at probably one of the methods, like probably a discounted cash flow method, using a market rate of interest and so on. So that is typically covered by Ind AS 113 in that sense.
Okay. The next question is for the example number 1 again. Can you explain from the investor's point of view whether FVTPL or FVOCI?
Okay, so let's go to the example 1.
Yes.
So if it is entirely kind of equity from an issuer perspective, then in all likelihood it should be equity from a holder perspective as well, because ideally, and then ideally it should be fair value through PNL. It will not be fair value through OCI.
Okay. The last question is, sir, had the option for redemption is with the issuer.
Yes. So then in that case, what we need to basically see is whether that is like a discretion of the issuer. So if let's say the redemption option is entirely with the issuer, then that instrument possibly may not be a liability, because the issuer will have an unconditional right to avoid the payment. So in those cases, probably that instrument may be equity.
Okay, sir. We have finished the questions. Over to Nilesh, sir.
Sure.
So your mic is off.
Sir, you can stop the screen sharing now. No issue. Thank you, Manan sir. It was a nice session. Now for the disclosures and fair value concept, we have CA Santosh Male today for this session. Before that, Manan sir, I would just like to know whether you are joining till the end of the session. You will be there till the end of the session. Sir, mic is off. Your mic is off.
Unmute.
Sorry. So unless there is anything specific, I think I was probably planning to drop off in a while.
Okay,
I mean,
fine. So I would now request Hiren Bhai to please present a vote of thanks to our first speaker of the day, Manan Lakhani ji. And
Thank you,
Sikandar,
Nilesh.
please continue the slide.
Thank you, Nilesh bhai. It was a wonderful session by CA Manan Lakhani. He has nicely covered various case studies on Ind AS 32 and 109 related to financial instruments. He has also covered various types of financial instruments in his presentations. I am sure this will be benefited to our members. BCS is thankful to him for sharing his experience and knowledge with us. Thank you, Manan bhai, for sparing your valuable time with us. Thank you. Thank you.
no, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot again, and stay safe, everyone, and take care.
Keep coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks a
thank
lot.
you.
So
Thank
now our second speaker of the day, CA Santosh Maler ji. Sir, are you there? Santosh sir?
Yeah, I'm there.
Yeah. So Santosh sir, I would now request you to please start your session.
Sure. Very good evening, all the participants, and hope you guys are doing fine and keeping safe. This session is on financial disclosures of financial instruments, and we all know, and fair value, of course. We all know that Ind AS 107 is a fairly complicated disclosure standard, and there are quite a few disclosures that when we work on financial statements of our clients, and we have to prepare the disclosures and check whether the disclosures are accurate and complete. The disclosures around financial instruments, particularly the financial risk management, are at times challenging, and it's difficult to figure out whether you got it all. So I would like to start the session by sharing this. Is the file visible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. So in February 2021, that is about a couple of months back, the Institute's Financial Reporting Review Board, FRRB, came out with a study report of financial statements, and this is the first report that they covered the Ind AS financial statements. Okay, this was generally they have picked up March 17 financials, and they generally come out with various data points as to which were the standards where maximum disclosure deficiencies were observed. And you can see the statistic, the pie chart on the screen, that hands down it was the financial instruments disclosures that they found maximum deficiencies in. So 13.79, and the next highest is segment reporting, Ind AS 108. So the point here is that even after about 3-4 years of experience in Ind AS, financial instruments disclosures under 107 or maybe even 113, these are by and large the most challenging, and the maximum deficiencies are observed in this standard. So it's very important for us to get the disclosures correct. So with that, let me just start the presentation. Is the presentation visible to all?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay. So I'll straight away start with the case studies. By and large, we know that this is more of a disclosure standard, and fair valuation. We know that Ind AS 113 requires. So Ind AS 113 is not a typical accounting standard which prescribes any accounting treatment as such. It lays down the framework for fair valuation under Ind AS for both financial instruments as well as for non-financial instruments. So there is no requirement as such that 113 prescribes that this is when fair valuation should be done or not done, but it lays down that whenever some other standards require fair valuation, then you have to fall back on the guiding principles and framework in Ind AS 113 to to determine fair valuation. So with that, let's start with the first case study. So A Limited is a listed company and that has to prepare Ind AS financial statements. A has investments of in 10,000 equity shares of B Limited, which is another listed company. As at 31st March, the quoted market price of B's shares is rupees 10 per share. So at the balance sheet date, the quoted price is rupees 10 per share. During the month of March, there is a significant fall in the share price of B due to the lockdown announcement. So there is, a decline in the stock market, the prices of this B company, B Limited. A's management believes that quoted price on 31st March is not reflective of the actual fair value, and therefore the value of the same and values the same using a valuation technique. Let's say, for example, DCF. The question here is this approach acceptable? Can A Limited say that there is no the 31st March quoted price is not reflective of the real fair value of the shares, and therefore can it rebut the quoted market price and therefore say that I won't go for the purpose of valuation, I will not go with the quoted market price, but I would go with the the valuation technique which I have determined based on maybe services of some valuation expert. So what do you think? The answer to this is no. You cannot do this because Ind AS 113, so far as financial instruments is concerned, there is a rule, paragraph 76 and 77 say that whenever you have a quoted, shares, quoted or financial assets which are quoted, you need to go by the level one inputs. You need to maximize the use of level one inputs. So the standard says that you cannot have a valuation which is ignoring the level one inputs. Of course, there are a few exceptions to this rule in paragraph 79 of Ind AS 113. That is when it's thinly traded or it's inactive. But in normal course, you cannot rebut this P times Q or price multiplied by quantity rule in paragraph 76 of Ind AS 113. And therefore, this company will have to go by the 10 rupees valuation at the balance sheet date. You cannot say that, this is not reflective of fair value because that's not something which is permitted under Ind AS 113. I'm sure you all will have questions. Maybe at certain intervals, I'll take the questions. Maybe in a batch of next 2-3 questions. I'll cover maybe 3-4 case studies and then take up some questions on related to that. Let's take another example. A is again a listed company preparing Ind AS financial statements. A has investments in 80,000 equity shares of B Limited, a listed company. It represents 19% of the total voting share capital of B. So it's a significant stake that A has in B. Not a controlling stake, not a significant influence, but a very, significant stake. At 31st March, the quoted price of these shares is rupees 10 per share. A's management believes that the quoted price on 31st March is not reflective of the actual fair value, since its holding in B is significantly high, and if it sells all shares, it will not be able to be sold in the market in one go due to the large holding size. So basically here the contention of the management is that I'm holding 19% stake in this company. If I sell this shares, because 113 goes by based on exit price, not entry price, but exit price. So hypothetically, if I sell my shares at 31st March, the market will not be able to absorb that, that much sale, and therefore the prices may tumble. So I would not, like to go by this 10 rupees share. Price per share. So again, whether this is acceptable. So again, this is not acceptable. P times Q again prevails in this case. In fact, this paragraph 69 of 113 specifically says that blockage factor. So this holding this aspect of, having high number of shares, it's known as something which is known as blockage factors, where you cannot use that as an input for valuation, because in 113 the concept is that you measure the fair value based on the characteristics of the assets or liability, not based on the characteristics of the holding, the person who's holding the those assets. So since this 19% stake, it's not something which is a characteristic of the shares, but it's a characteristic of this A Limited who's holding the 19% stake, and therefore that cannot be considered in valuing the shares. So again, P times Q prevails in this case. Next case study is again a listed company. Under Ind AS, it prepares financial statements. A's accounting policy on financial guarantees reads as follows. Financial guarantee contracts, other than those which are in the nature of insurance contracts, are those contracts that require a payment to be made to reimburse the holder for a loss it incurs because the specified party fails to make payment when due in accordance with the terms of debt instrument. Corporate guarantee are in the nature of insurance contracts. Question is this acceptable? Is this accounting policy fine as per Ind AS requirements? This example I picked up directly from the FRRB observations, and this was interestingly, this is one of the case that they covered. They don't, of course, state the name of the companies, but they have, the facts, the technical analysis, and the observation, the objection, the deficiencies that they found out. So here basically Ind AS, this company is treating its corporate guarantees under Ind AS 104, not Ind AS 109. So it's an insurance contract as per the policy of the company. So here the point is that the standard Ind AS 104 paragraph 15 requires all insurance contracts to be to undergo a liability adequacy test. Okay, so basically this test would require whether the counterparty, the subsidiary, is having enough financial strength to meet its primary obligation, and therefore this has to be done on each balance sheet date. So this policy has not been disclosed in the accounting policies of this company, and therefore it's a non-compliance with the standard, that is Ind AS 104. So that's the point here. Let's take this example. A's borrowing consists of bank loan of rupees 10 crores bearing interest at 10% per annum, repayable after 3 years. So A Limited, an Ind AS compliant company, has 10 crores of borrowings bearing interest of 10% per annum, repayable after 3 years. A had provided financial guarantee of rupees 20 crores to a bank on behalf of its subsidiary company, the guarantee liability is recognized in the books of A at fair value of rupees 1 crores. Under the financial risk management disclosures, under liquidity risk, A presents rupees 10 crores under maturity analysis of financial liabilities, and financial guarantee is presented under liquidity risk maturity analysis at rupees 1 crores, that is the book value of the guarantee. Question is, are these disclosures correct? So under Ind AS 107, paragraph 39 states that when it comes to maturity analysis, you cannot have, you need to have contractual maturities disclosed. So contractual maturities would include future interest costs. So in the first case, that is 10 crore loans, you will not just disclose the 10 crore in your maturity analysis table under liquidity risk, but also disclose the interest for next 3 years. Okay. And that will be the contractual maturity. So even if that interest is not recognized in the balance sheet because it's future interest, so you will not, you will not have the balance sheet amount matching with the contractual, with the maturity analysis table. But maturity analysis disclosures will be, the numbers will be higher than the balance sheet figure, and therefore you should include future interest costs in your maturity analysis disclosure. Likewise, in case of this financial guarantee contracts, what Ind AS 107 paragraph B 11C states is that an entity is required to disclose maturity analysis for financial liabilities that show the remaining contractual maturities for some of the financial disclosures, for some financial liabilities. In this disclosure for issued financial guarantee contracts, the maximum amount of guarantee is allocated to the earliest period in which the guarantee could be called. So in case of guarantee, what happens is the gross value is 20 crores. Okay, the fair value that I have computed is 1 crore. Okay, in maturity analysis table, what figure I have to disclose is 20 crores. That's the maximum amount that I could be called to pay to the bank. And it doesn't matter that the balance sheet value is just 1 crore. So in this case, you will have to show this as, within 1 year on demand as such, and it has to be, the value has to be the gross value of 20 crores. So maybe, yeah, so should we take the questions now or should we take questions altogether?
It's up to you, sir. Whatever you feel.
Yeah, because maybe later we may just forget the first example. So
Yes, no issue.
let me just check the chat box. Okay, no questions so far.
It's there in the Q&A tab, sir. If you want, I can read it out for you.
So there are two questions, sir.
Okay, can you
Can I
please
read?
read it out?
Yes, sir. The first question is for the holder of the instrument, whether investment in 0% CCD will have to be bifurcated as an investment in CCD and investment in equity, or it can remain as an investment in CCD.
Yeah, I think that's a question pertaining to the first.
Right, sir.
First session.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe we can just. What's the second question you said?
Second.
Does subsidiary company has option of not to measure and
I think
recognize
again that's
corporate
subsidiary company has option not to measure
and recognize corporate guarantee issued by parent company?
Yeah, that's a good question. There is an option. See, because Ind AS 109 doesn't deal with the accounting from perspective of the beneficiary company, that is the subsidiary company on whose behalf the guarantee has been given by the holding company.
Okay.
So since there is no compulsion, you need not account for the guarantee benefit, because ultimately you have the loan, the subsidiary has the loan in its balance sheet, and it has the interest cost towards the bank. So there's no compulsion. But having said that, if one wants to account, you can do a mirror accounting of the accounting in the books of subsidiaries. So you can mirror the accounting that the parent company is doing. So you can set up a prepaid expense and set up a capital, capital reserve, a promoter's contribution directly in equity, because you're not, I'm assuming that there is no recharge between the subsidiary and the parent. So in that case, you can have a capital contribution and a asset in your balance sheet, and you will amortize that over the period of the guarantee.
Right.
Okay.
So questions has been finished.
Yeah, you can read. Yeah.
Completed, sir. All
Okay.
questions completed.
Okay. A is a listed company that prepares Ind AS financial statements. In the notes to financial statements of the company, under non-current borrowing, loans from related parties were classified as non-current. These loans from related parties are interest-free and repayable terms were not stipulated. Are these disclosures correct? So again, this example is picked up from the FRRB report, where this was one of the observations by the FRRB. So the answer is it's wrong, because if it's interest-free and if it's repayable, there are no repayment terms, then it would be treated as, it's repayable on demand. That is, the loans would be callable on demand, in which case you will have to present it as current rather than non-current, in lines with Ind AS 1 and Ind AS 107. So you cannot present, and this is typically a scenario which we often come across in group companies which have loans from group companies or related parties, that the terms of repayments are not specified. Preference shares, for example, the terms are not specified. So in that case, one has to really see, whether it becomes current liability as per the principles of Ind AS 107 and Ind AS 1. A Limited is a listed company preparing its financial statements under Ind AS. A's trade receivables from its holding company constitutes major part of its total receivables. Under financial risk management disclosure, A Limited has stated that no credit risk is involved for trade receivables from holding company. So can you do this? Can you say that I don't have any credit risk for the receivables from holding company, and therefore I don't need to measure, I don't need to calculate ECL provision on this? The answer is not, because in Ind AS 107 paragraph 35M, one has to perform credit risk analysis and ECL calculation on all the receivables, and especially if there is a significant credit risk concentration. The fact pattern says that majority of the major part of the trade receivables are from the holding company, and therefore you will be exposed to the credit risk of the holding company. In this case, you will have to test it for ECL, and you will have to make appropriate disclosures under this Ind AS 107. Oftentimes, it so happens that in standalone financials, we have trade receivables from group companies, and generally we do not think about the ECL part of the accounting from receivables from group companies. There is no exemption under Ind AS 109 or 107 for not to perform ECL for dues from group companies or related parties, and therefore one has to so even if from consolidated financials perspective, even if they are getting eliminated, that doesn't matter. From a standalone financials perspective, you'll still have to, calculate the ECL and think about the credit risk. A Limited is a listed company preparing its financial statements under Ind AS. In notes to financial statements of the company, various defaults in the repayment of loans were given. In the auditor's report, the auditor reported that there have been delay in timely repayment of dues. Further, the auditor reported the status of the payments, the remediation, etc. before date of approval of the financial statements. So here's a company which has had certain defaults in repayment of loans, and there were delays in timely repayment of dues. But subsequently, apparently the company has remediated certain loans, and the auditor's report has also given disclosures to that effect. So here the disclosure deficiency is basically under Ind AS 107, paragraph 18, for loans payable recognized at the end of the reporting period. An entity shall disclose details of any defaults, the carrying amount of loans repayable in default at the end of the reporting period, and most importantly, whether the default was remediated or the terms of the loans repayable were renegotiated before the financial statements were approved for issue. So even if it's a non-adjusting event, the remediation part has to be disclosed as per the requirements of Ind AS 107, and therefore one has to make that disclosures in the financial statement. And it's not that the auditor's report mentioning that will excuse the non-disclosure in the financial statements. The financial statements have to be compliant with all the Ind AS disclosures. They will have to also carry out these disclosures. A is a Ind AS compliant company. In the financials of A Limited, in notes to financial statements on other income, fair value changes of investment designated as FVL, FVTPL were present. So basically here in this case, as a part of other income, there is this fair value changes on investments designated as FVPL. It's presented. So again, this is an example of observation from FRRB report. The issuers, as per paragraph 9.2 of the Institute's guidance note on Schedule 3, Division 2, states that the aggregate of other income is to be disclosed on face of the P&L as per Note 5 of General Instructions for preparation of statement of P&L. Other income shall be classified as interest income, dividend income, and other non-operating income, net of expenses directly attributable to such income. So as per this FRRB report, the fair valuation gains and losses on financial assets, which are measured at FVTPL, should be presented under other non-operating income and not part of other operating income. Therefore, fair value changes on financial instruments should have been disclosed under non-operating income as per the Institute's guidance note. So again, this fair value gains and losses, where to present, how to present is, at times can get tricky. One has to really look into, this guidance note so far as the presentation, appropriate presentation is concerned. So with this, then we can have some questions and answers.
Yes, sir. There are two questions. The first one is, can you please explain how to carry out credit risk analysis and ECL?
So this is in context of what? Trade receivables, or so is it possible to unmute the queries, the person who has asked? To elaborate on the question? Because ECL analysis can be for trade receivables, it can be based on provision metrics, it can be based on the three-stage general approach for for NBFCs that we do.
So it is for
Trade receivable.
So it is for trade receivable.
Yeah, trade receivables. Okay.
Yes, sir.
So in trade receivables, what happens is you need to, let's go step by step. So first of all, you look into the historical trend. Okay, there is no under Ind AS 109, there is no prescribed period of looking back at how far behind to look into. Okay, so it can be 3 years, it can be 3 years, it can be 4 years, it can be whatever. Basically, the idea is that you should cover adequate period to cover one business cycle. Okay, so for example, if I am doing March 21 ECL analysis, if I consider only 1 year, it will be all, it will not be correct, because last year, as we all know, was a pandemic year. So my realization during the course of 2021 would be all generally be delayed. So therefore, I should at least cover last 3 years, so that even during the times where realization was good, I'm good, it averages out. So ideally, I should have a good, a business cycle at least covered. Now, what do? I do first a matrix of, generally what we do is a quarterly kind of DPD table, where basically you see that every quarter, what is the trend, what is the outstanding position, let's say based on buckets of not due, okay, 0 to 90 days, 90 to 180 days, and so on and so forth. So I do this based on the aging analysis, based on not the invoice date, but based on the due dates. So for example, generally, if I have 30 days credit term, I should calculate the DPD table based on the due date position and not the invoice date. So that care one should take care. Then what happens? So I have this trend. So I should then be doing a quarterly aging analysis. I cannot be doing it on March to March, because if my time bucket is 90 day, at 90 day break, so 0 to 90 is like 1 quarter, right? So I should be doing it for 4 quarters. So for last 3 years, so 12 quarters ka historical trend I should get in. When I do this and I plot it in an Excel spreadsheet, I do the second step. So this is the actual historical trend. Second step is I calculate what is known as a flow rate, that is calculated by, let's say for example, agar mera not due December 20 के quarter में, let's say if I had not due of, let's say 100 rupees, and on 31st March 2021, my 0 to 90 ka table, I have let's say 80 rupees. What this means, what it means is that from last quarter's 100 rupees, 20 rupees has been realized, 80 rupees is still outstanding, right? Because it will always go in that flow. No due, no debtor will be directly more than 180 days or more than 360 days. It will go logically, that is, first it will be not due, 0 to 90 days, 90 to 180 days, and so on and so forth. So in this case, if it's 80 for March 2021, 0 to 90 days, and if it's December 20 ke liye, if it was 100, then it's my flow rate is 80%. So 80% for this specific quarter, for this specific bucket, it was 50. So like that, I need to calculate based on a formula the flow rate for each bucket, for each quarter, for the entire history of my whatever 12 quarters or 16 quarters or whatever I'm calculating. The next step is basically, having done that, I calculate the average annual flow rate for each bucket. Uske baad, if let's say I'm doing the ECL of trade receivables as of 31st March 2021, I again plot the realization, the trade receivable based on not due 0 to 90 days, etc. And then I calculate based on the average that I calculated in the earlier step. I multiply it with the flow rate that I calculated based on this. So, for example, in not due case, I may have a very minuscule thing because it's product. Okay, so logically, what this method says is that if let's say 1,000 rupees is my not due as of 31st March 2021, and let's say if my flow rate of not due to 0 to 90 days, 0 to 90 days to 90 to 180 days is various percentages. So the chances of default in this 1,000 rupees of not due figure as of 31st March 2021 is the product of all the flow rates that I've calculated as per the previous step. So, that would be like a minuscule because I'll multiply, let's say 20%, 80%, 60, जो भी मेरे को percentages आया है, I'll calculate based on that. So that will be the ECL for that bucket. Likewise, for the next bucket also, 0 to 90 days, 90 to 180 days, etc. I should calculate. So whatever the actual position on 31st March, I should calculate the product of the flow rate that I determined based on the earlier step. Last but not the least, so this is just historical trend, right? I've not considered the future forward-looking outlook. I have not calculated till now. So this is the historical credit, credit risk trend. For future, I should actually see whether this is I'm expecting faster realization or slower realization in the next few months. And again, because of this second wave of this coronavirus, again, there would be a bit of concern on, the realizations being slower. And therefore, I should, top up whatever ECL based on historical trend I'm getting to. I should top it up by, whatever, it can be 3%, 5%, 10%, depending on what sector, on, what is the credit health of your customer base. So for example, let's say if you are dealing primarily with real estate companies, let's say if you are a steel company or a cement company, which is supplying primarily to real estate companies. In that case, you may have very slow credit realization in the next few months. Likewise, let's say if your customer base is in aviation sector and with the lockdowns and all that, you may actually expect, worse, more, delays in realization that you should factor in your future outlook. So that is again a top up of a 5% or 10% or whatever you estimate to your historical trend. Actually, this is something which, it's better understood with an example and in an Excel spreadsheet. Not part of the topic, but I tried to explain, this simply by just, orally explaining. But maybe, at a later stage, we can have a session on ECL itself. Any other questions?
Yes, sir. The next question is by CA Manoj Modi, and he has asked, holding company has given interest-free loan to subsidiary company. Subsidiary company has recognized fair value interest as a capital contribution from holding company. Can subsidiary company also show loan received from the holding company as a capital contribution in any case or scenario?
Can the holding company also show?
Can subsidiary company also show loan received from the holding company as a capital contribution in any case or scenario?
In any case or scenario?
Yes, sir.
So let me repeat the question. So there is a holding company which has given interest-free loan to subsidiary, and the fair value differential from the subsidiary's perspective, basically the accounting is I recognize the loan at fair value. Okay, and the fair value differential is credited to capital reserve or a capital contribution directly to equity, because that's the off market rate kind of element. Subsequently, what happens is the loan is measured at effective interest rate, and subsequently you will have a notional interest cost, which the subsidiary will book in the P&L as a finance cost. And eventually when the loan matures, you will book so much interest that you will get to the principal, the gross value of the loan, and at that date you will have the full liability in your books. Basically, the capital contribution part is Milanji, it's basically since it's interest free, it's like a bounty that you have received from your holding company, which you wouldn't have received had it not been your holding company, and therefore in that case you will have to, that's why you book it as a capital contribution. The notional interest rate is nothing but the time value of money that you book under Ind AS. As we all know, Ind AS has this concept of fair value and time value of money. So you cannot directly have the loan, the gross loan itself, sitting in the capital contribution.
The last question is by CM Mahesh Gohil, and he has asked, is there any exemption of customer like government institution, and he has taken example as a canteen store department, to exclude from ECL calculation?
Good question, actually, Mahesh ji. There is this ITFG in one of its bulletin. It dealt with this issue of whether there is a government, when your customer is a government company or a government department or a government agency. Can I contend that there is no default risk that you will have in a government, and therefore can I just not do ECL? There is no such exemption under Ind AS 109. You will have to consider ECL. You will have to calculate ECL on such things. There is no exemption for government. Reason being that although there is a sovereign guarantee, and there is the default risk may not be there theoretically. ECL in Ind AS 109, there is still a consideration that you have for time value of money. So in one of the paragraphs of Ind AS 109, it specifically requires you to take care of the delayed risk. So default under Ind AS 109 would also mean delay, that is not paying on time. So therefore, typically these companies which have government companies as its base. So for example, let's take example of fertilizer companies who have these subsidies which are receivable from government, from the government, state governments. Very seldom do they actually get their money on time. It takes at times 3-4 years to realize their money from the government. So therefore, there is a significant delay risk, unfortunately, in India. So to answer your question, there is no exemption. ECL has to be calculated. You cannot contend that there is no default risk because there is a sovereign backing, etc. Because there is still a delay risk in the government dues. So you'll have to. There is no exemption. You'll have to calculate ECL.
Yes, sir. Questions are over, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Santosh ji. Thanks a lot. You can stop the screen sharing, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Santosh ji. Before I inform Hiren bhai for propose a very well deserved vote of thanks, 2-3 announcements are there. BCSE next meeting is on 17th April regarding recent controversies and probable disputes under GST, with CA Avinash Podarji is going to take the session. It is from 5 to 7. Members, please note there are likely chances that the seminar may be preponed from 4 to 6 due to some reasons, but it will be well intimated to all the members. Second seminar is on 18th Sunday, 18th April. The timings are from 10:30 to 12:30, and a very well renowned and esteemed speaker Dr. Girish Ahuja. I think everyone knows Dr. Girish Ahuja. He is the speaker of that session, and it is regarding important amendments in Finance Act, Finance Act 2021. So these are the things. Thirdly, of course, all are members of BCSE present in this session. But those still want to be a member of BCSE, any of your friends or anyone, tomorrow, 15th April, is the last day for the early bird discount. So anyone who has left over in any of your circle for becoming a member of BCSE, you can just intimate him to get the early bird discount benefit till tomorrow. And from 16, the fees will get increased. Thank you very much, members. Now I'd request Hiren Bhai to propose a very, very deserved vote of thanks to CA Santosh Malerji.
Nilesh bhai, members, you all agree with me. Santosh ji has nicely explained both Ind AS 107 and 113 by providing various case studies. He has also provided answers to questions of our members. He has nicely explained ECL calculations, which is really complicated otherwise. Santosh ji, we are thankful to you for sharing your expert knowledge on Ind AS with us. Thanks for sparing your valuable time with us. Thanks a lot. Members, we are concluding this session. So we are very thankful to all of you for participating in the large numbers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, members. Thank you, my team, fellow members. Thank you, both the
Thank you very
speakers, and stay fit and fine. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you all. Thanks
Thank
for
you,
the
Santosh.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.